Ethiopian rebel umbrella group, the EPRDF, arrived at today's talks in London, their hand greatly strengthened by their capture of Addis Ababa overnight. They were joined by the Eritreans, the EPLF, who've been fighting for independence for 30 years. But there was no sign of the Ethiopian Prime Minister, clearly angered by developments in the past 24 hours. The talks were hosted by the United States, which wants to see a broad-based transitional government in place as soon as possible, and democratic elections in less than a year. Observers had expected the Ethiopian government might stand in the way of such a proposal, but in their absence, an agreement in principle was announced within hours.
The EPRDF, EPLF, and OLF have agreed to hold a follow-up conference not later than July 1 to discuss the details of the transition period in general. And
a ceasefire agreement was announced today in Ethiopia's long civil war. It allows for control of the capital city by a rebel group known as the EPRDF. The announcement came as U.S.-sponsored peace talks between the government and several rebel groups began in London. We have a report by Simon Cole of Worldwide Television News.
Ethiopian Prime Minister Dinka, with his capital surrounded by rebels, knew his government would have to step down. All morning, rebel delegations came and went before the American brokers announced the breakthrough.
As I speak, a ceasefire is being announced in Addis Ababa by the interim government. In order to reduce uncertainties and eliminate tensions in the city, and after consulting with all of the parties, the United States government is recommending that the forces of the EPRDF enter the city as soon as possible to help stabilize the situation.
But the deal didn't please exiles who shouted for unity. Ethiopians against war simply don't trust the EPRDF.
In the short term, we feel that this proposal will only secure a bogus and short-lived peace. In the long run, we view it is like asking Ethiopia to sign her own death warrant.
After telephone negotiations, the EPRDF arrived personally to reassure the Americans that they can control events in Ethiopia. Now they have to convince a people tired of war.
Late today, there were conflicting reports about whether the rebel troops had in fact taken control in the Ethiopian capital. At first, rebel radio said they had entered Addis Ababa, but later reports said they were prepared to do so.
This time continues to be the famine in Africa. The tragedy of men, women, and little children by the thousands dying of thirst, starvation, and disease. Clearly, the most disgusting sidebar story to this main event is the one of political murder, the continuing charge that with the silent acquiescence of the United Nations and others, the Ethiopian government is intentionally preventing food and other aid from reaching some of its people. They are the residents of the provinces of Eritrea and Tigray in northern Ethiopia near the Sudan. There have been civil wars going on in these areas for years, for some as many as 25 years. For some, the wars are for local autonomy from the Ethiopian government. For others, it's the overthrow of the Ethiopian government completely. It is this political part of the Ethiopian famine tragedy that we focus on first and foremost tonight. Representatives of the Ethiopian government and the United Nations are here, as is the head of the U.S. government's relief organization. But first, the charge is laid out in this documentary report by correspondent Terence McKenna of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for the CBC's The Journal program.
Anyone who believes that the Ethiopian government is in control of the whole country is in for a surprise when they visit the famine areas in the north. It is the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, that calls the shots here. They're a coalition of opposition groups from Tigray province that banded together and launched a civil war 9 years ago. Although some of the leaders are said to be communist, they claim they're not fighting for any political dogma. They're fighting to save their Tigrinya language and culture. The rebels are well organized and well armed. The weapons in this field exercise all captured from the Ethiopian army. They are now allies with the rebels in the neighboring province of Eritrea, who've been fighting the government for 23 years. You have to look at a map of Ethiopia to understand how the political situation affects the famine areas in the north. The one major road from the capital of Addis Ababa through the northern provinces of Tigray and Eritrea is controlled by Ethiopian government troops. On that road at Korum and Mekelle are the refugee camps familiar from recent television newscasts. There are fewer than 200,000 people in the government camps along this road, but there are up to 4 million people at risk of starvation living in the rebel-held areas around the province of Tigray. The Ethiopian government seldom enters rebel territory, but they tell the world that they are delivering food everywhere in the country. This is the Ethiopian government camp of Korum, where 54,000 famine victims are receiving daily rations. The government, though, has a different approach to the millions of famine victims in the surrounding hills controlled by the guerrillas, where observers see a military solution being imposed.
I believe, especially after this trip and talking to the drought migrants, that the Ethiopian government intends to starve out a population that it has been unsuccessful in crushing militarily for the past almost 10 years.
The military authorities, essentially the junta, saw food shortage in Eritrea, Tigray, as a strategic weapon in their own hands. And they were quite prepared, as I suppose military authorities have been throughout history, quite prepared to use the enemy's shortage of supplies as a weapon.
The famine victims in rebel-held areas have been deprived of food and medicine for so long. When they finally reach help, it's often too late. These families have watched their loved ones die, killed not only by the intentional withholding of food, but killed by the active government campaigns against them.
We have eyewitness reports, Europeans as well as Ethiopians, who saw the army going from place to place and burning crops in a place where crops are very precious. And that cannot mean anything else as trying to serve the people.
The combination of the civil war and the drought has triggered a massive exodus of people from the rebel-held areas of northern Ethiopia toward the border with neighboring Sudan, especially to the area around the Sudanese town of Kassala. To hold back the approaching waves of humanity, the rebels are attempting to build their own relief operation. On the outskirts of Kassala, the Relief Society of Tigray is running a mill where wheat donated by the International Red Cross is ground into flour. The biggest problem is how to transport this food to those in need. The rebels have only 30...
United Nations, if it did that, a government, the present government, can say this is interference in my own internal affairs. Because they can always find a way of explaining that. And what would serve the United Nations? The United Nations cannot work if the government says, no, stop, you're not allowed to come in.
But surely, when people are starving, if the truth is that relief is not reaching most of the famine victims, that's more important than the diplomatic niceties of the way the United Nations works.
I entirely agree with you as an individual, but as coordinator, I must tell you that in each resolution which has been passed in the United Nations, there has been a paragraph saying the sovereignty of the country must be respected.
What price would the United Nations organizations pay by saying this is the situation, even if it is insulting to the government of Ethiopia?
It will not be able to intervene in the country at all.
You believe that the Ethiopian government would kick out the United Nations organizations?
I tell you that if I do it, Andrew will not be able to work there. That I am not believe, I'm certain.
10 years ago, the UN organizations made a solemn pledge that death by starvation would be eradicated from the planet by 1984. They failed. Until the UN can make an agreement that will eliminate the politics that withholds food from the starving, this scene will happen again and again.
To answer these charges, we have first Ethiopia's ambassador to the United Nations, Berhanu Dinka. Mr. Ambassador, how do you respond to the basic charge in that report that your government is deliberately withholding food from most of the famine victims because they live in the two rebel provinces?
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. My reaction to the film that we've just seen is one of indignation, because the whole story is based on hearsay and allegations made by 2 or 3 individuals, namely Dan Connell, Chris Carter, and Mr. Elliott of the British Independent Aid.
All representatives of different independent aid organizations.
Aid organizations who have who are not participating in any manner in the assistance that's being given to Ethiopia. They are not operating in Ethiopia. These people are working some in Britain and in Boston. In the case of Mr. Dan Connell and Chris Carter of Grassroots International, they are not operating in Ethiopia. They have not seen what's going on. They have not been there. And basically, the 3 of them are well known to European audiences, to us, to Ethiopians, and to our neighbors as people who have committed themselves for over a decade now to the cause of the rebellion movement in Ethiopia, in the northern region of Ethiopia.
Let me give you an opportunity to answer the very specific charges.
Yes,
you heard not only from them, but from your countrymen who were among those refugees, who say the government is killing refugees.
The government of Ethiopia kills us and burns us. Wherever we go, without any reason, they kill, burn, and destroy everything.
መላ ኢትዮጵያ ህዝብ እንዲገነዘብ የሚያስፈልገው 1977 በሰሜኑ ሀገራችን ክፍል ድርቅ ሲያጋጥም ያንን ድርቅ ጁንታውም ሌላውም ኃይል መጠቀም ያርጎታል። እስከ 1977 ድረስ ቲፒኤልኤፍ አንዲት ከተማ አንዲት ዞን የኔ የሚለው አልነበረውም። ጠንካራ የሚባል ውጊያም አድርጎ ያቅም። የደርግ መንግስት ፈተና የነበረው እስከ 77 ድረስ የሻዕቢያ ወታደር የሚባለው እንጂ የወያኔ ወታደር ሄዴክ አልነበረም። ነገር ግን 77 ረሃቡ መጣ ሲባል የምናምን ኮሪደር ይከፈተው ሱዳን በኩል ተብሎ የደርግ መንግስት እንዲወርቅ የሚፈልጉ ኃይሎች በአካል ጭምር በረሃ ገብተው በስትራቴጂውም በስልጠናውም በሐሳቡም በገንዘቡም በትጥቁም አብረው ሆነው ከ77 በኋላ ነው ወያኔ ተጠናክሮ በ81 ሽሬን እንኳን መቋጠር የተቻለው።
ድርቁን ተጠቅሞበታል ይላል
በደንብ።
ስለዚህ አሁንም ረሃብና ድርቅን የመጠቀም ፕሮፓጋንዳ ላይ ነው የሚለው።
አሁን ጁንታው ብቻ ሳይሆን የዛን ጊዜ ይሄን ሐሳብ አምጥተው ጁንታን አስታጥቀው ወያኔን አስታጥቀው የደርግ መንግስት እንዲወድቅ ያደረጉ ኃይሎች አዲስ ፈጠራ መፍጠር አልቻሉም። እዛው ነው የቆሙት። የዛሬ 30 40 ዓመት በሰሩት ታክቲክ አሁንም መልሶ መጠቀም ይፈልጋሉ። ይሄ መቼም አይሆንም። ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ አክሰስ ተፈቅዷል። ማንኛውም ኤንጂኦ ዛሬ ከ200 በላይ ኤንጂኦ እና ዩኤን ስታፎች ትግራይ እንቀሳቀሳሉ። የውጭ ሚዲያዎች እንቀሳቀሳሉ። አክሰስ በብዙ ቦታ ክፍት ነው። 2 ቦታ ብቻ ነበር እንደ ፈተና ያየ ነው። እሱም ቦታ የሀገር መከላከያ ሰራዊት እያጀባችሁ አድርሱ ሲባሉ አይፈልጉም መታጀብ። ምክንያቱም የሚያስቡትን ዓላማ ስለማያሳካ
መንግስት ይሄን ያክል ጥረት ካደረገና ድጋፍ ካደረገ ለምንድን ነው አሁንም ቢሆን የሰብአዊ ድጋፍና እርዳታዎችን ለማድረስ በሮች ሁሉ ይከፈቱ የሚሉት ወታ የሚሰማው?
በነገራችን ላይ 1 ኪሎ ስንዴ አምጥቶ ያቺን ኪሎ ስንዴ ለህዝባችን እንዳያደርስ ተከለከለ አንድም